In this video, I'm going to show you how I drafted this pattern in Inkscape, which is a free vector drawing software. I'm going to leave a link in the description to where you can download Inkscape and also to a playlist of video tutorials about how to use Inkscape for beginners. So if you're completely new to Inkscape, you can follow those tutorials just to get your bearings. You don't have to follow all of them, just a few until you feel comfortable. So the first thing you need to do when you want to draft a cloth pad pattern is decide on your key measurements. So this is going to be an asymmetrical pad, so the front is shorter than the back. And the front length in my case is 12 centimeters, and the back length is 15 centimeters. And it doesn't matter if you're working in inches or centimeters. I work in centimeters, but you can follow along in inches. And the width of the pad, which is the width here when the wings are folded over, is 6.4 centimeters. And I also decided on the distance between the snap and the wing tip here, which is 1.5 centimeters. So let me just hide a few of these layers. And I'm just going to go through how I drew the pad, and then I'll show you in detail each step. So first I set up these guides, which are these blue lines here. So I first set up this crosshair guide, which are sort of like the center of the pad. And then I set up this guide up here, which is 12 centimeters away, or 12 centimeters up. So that's the front length of the pad. And I set up this guide, which is half of the width of the pad. So that's, if my pad width is 6.4, then the distance here is 3.2 centimeters, which is half of 6.4. And then again, another 3.2 centimeters for where the snap is, because when the snap is snapped shut, it has to fold along this line and get to this center point. That's why the distance from here to here is equal to the distance from here to here. And then I have this other guide, which is 1.5 centimeters away from the snap, which is for the fabric overlap, or the extra fabric that you have after the snap. So the first step for me was in drafting this pattern was to set up these guides. The second step was to create this skeleton, which is just a simple shape that describes the pad without any curves first. And after I have my skeleton, I created my template, which is just the skeleton with the curves the way that I want them. And you can see that my skeleton has a flare, but you don't have to have a flare, or you can have less of a flare, however you want. I just find flares to be really comfortable. And you can have a different shape of a wingtip, or however you want your pad to be shaped. Now we're only at this stage making half of the pad because it's symmetrical along the center line. And if you were making a symmetrical pad, meaning that the front and the back were identical, you could draft just 1/4 of a pad. And once I drafted the template, let me hide the skeleton. So this was my template, and let me hide the guides. So this was the template. This is the fold when the wings are folded. And this is the stitching line, or the finished size of the pad. And then what I did was I created the topper and backer layer. So basically I duplicated the template, and I created a mirror image of the template and glued those two pieces together. After that, I created the seam allowance. So this would be the cutting line for the topper and backer, and this is just the stitching line. And then I created the core, or the cutting line for the core, and the top stitching guide for the core, so that if you want to top stitch your core from the topper side, you can use this guide to do that, to get a precisely placed top stitching line, and not just follow the edge of the core fabric, which sometimes moves around, and then your top stitching looks off compared to the edge of your pad. I also added these lines for printing. So this is the fold so that you can measure that from here to here. You want to make sure that this is the desired width of your pad. And the center line can help you align your topper and backer depending on how you sew your pad together. And I added some text. So I wrote that this is the cutting line, this is the stitching line, these are the snaps, this is the core cutting line, and this is the core top stitching line. And then I wrote just a name for my pad and the important dimensions. Now, another thing I forgot to write here is that the seam allowance, or the distance between the stitching line and the cutting line, is 7 millimeters in my case. And that's important because if you don't use this stitching line as a guide, you're going to use half a presser foot as a guide. You need this distance to be according to the distance that your presser foot is away from the edge of the fabric. So that's just an overview of how this pad was constructed. And now let's create a blank document and draft this pad from scratch. So this is a new Inkscape document, and I can scroll using the mouse roller wheel, and I can also hold the control key and scroll with the mouse roller wheel to zoom in and out. And if I hold down the mouse scroller wheel, I can move this around. So this represents the printed page, but I'm gonna just ignore this and not rely on it. But what I am gonna do is just drag down a guide from here and drag a guide from here. And then I'm gonna go to File, Document Properties, and under Page, I'm gonna uncheck Show Page Border. So I don't have that page border, I'm not gonna need it. Okay, so we have our guides, and this is the center of the pad. Now we want a guide that's 12 centimeters up, or however long the front of the pad is. So the way I do that is I drag a guide to the exact same place as this guide, and I double click, and then I click on relative change, and then I say I want to work in centimeters, and I want it to be 12 centimeters up on the y-axis. So the y-axis is up and down, the x-axis is right and left. So 12 centimeters up. You can always check your measurements by using this ruler or measurement tool. Click here and drag to here, and it'll tell you it's 120 millimeters, which is 12 centimeters. And it's important to have this set, the snap guides, selected, so that whenever you're working, the stuff that you're drawing is going to snap to your guides. Okay, so we have the center lines, and we have this border, or the topmost edge of the pad. Now let's drag another one to the center, and let's move this guide. So I'm double clicking, and then relative change centimeters. I want it to move right 3.2 centimeters because the width of my pad is 6.4 centimeters, so 3.2 is half of that. And I'm also going to move it up 4 centimeters. So what that does is it gives me the point where the wing attaches to the pad. I forgot to mention that before. So I chose to have the wing to be 8 centimeters wide at the point it attaches to the pad. And now I need another guide that's another 3.2 centimeters away from this guide for where the snap is going to be. So I'm going to drag another guide to here and double click, and 3.2 centimeters right on the x-axis, and there is the snap. And another guide starting at where the snap is, double click, and I want to move 1.2 centimeters right for where or 1.5 centimeters right for where the tip of the wing is going to be. So this is the center of the snap, and then this is the tip of the wing. So you can use 1 centimeter, 2 centimeters, or anything in between that's fine, whatever you prefer. And now our guides are done. So I'm going to go and choose the Draw Bezier Curves tool, and I'm going to click on this dot. Make sure you get this marking, handle to guide origin, because that means it's snapping to the guide. So click, click, click here, here, and skip this one because this is the snap here, and then make sure it turns red and click to close the shape. And now you can click on any color here just to have it more visible that this is the shape that you drafted. So this would be the front of your pad and this would be your wing. Now I want my wing to have a bit more width at the tip. I don't want it to be pointy. So what I'm gonna do is select the Edit Paths by Nodes tool and just double click here or click to add another node so that I can move this around and move it over here to the same point. I want to move it up by 0.5 centimeter. So I do that by going to Preferences and going to Behavior, Steps, and then arrow keys move by 0.5 centimeter. So when I select this point and press the arrow, the up key, it'll move it up by 0.5 centimeter. So 0.5 centimeter I think will work. So now that we've drafted this front part of the pad, if you want a symmetrical pad, you just work on 1/4 of the pad until we get to the topper and backer part. But since this is an asymmetrical pad, I'm gonna make the back part longer. So I select the pad when I'm in this mode, select and transform object, select, and click on Control D to duplicate. And I'm gonna flip selected objects vertically and drag this down and make sure that it snaps. Cusp node to guide intersection so that they're totally aligned along this line. Then I select both of them by clicking the first one and holding down Shift and selecting the second one. And then I do Path, Union, and that merged them to be one object or one path. Now, I want to make the back length 3 centimeters longer because this is 12 and this should be 15, so that's 3 centimeters longer. So you could do that by adding another guide, or what you could do is go to Preferences and make sure that your arrow keys move by is set to 1 centimeter, and then go to your node tool, select this node, and then go 1, 2, 3, that's 3 centimeters down, and this one, 1, 2, 3, 3 centimeters down. Now, if you want your pad without any flare, then you wouldn't do this step, but I like to have a flare, so I like to move this node 1, 2, 3, 4 centimeters, and this one 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 centimeters, and that's my guide for my flare. The flare will be something like that. And we are done with the skeleton. So right now I'm gonna go to layers, and this will open up this layers, and I have a layer named layer 1. I can show it and hide it, and I'm gonna rename the layer. So right click, rename layer, I'm gonna call it skeleton. So the skeleton, I want it also to have this snap placement so that I can hide my guides. So you can do this now or later. So what I do is I select the circle, I click here and I hold down Shift, and that way the circle's center is in this snap point. Now it doesn't matter how large you make your circle, because after you've made it, you go over here and you say, I want the radius to be 1 millimeter by 1 millimeter, or however large you want it. And then click on black to fill it in black, and then Shift and click here to erase the stroke so that you have a 1 millimeter radius circle over here. So that will be part of my skeleton. And I also sometimes add the fold line as part of my skeleton, but I'm not going to add it this time. So the skeleton is done. Let's duplicate it, and we'll call this template. And I'm going to just change the color to whatever, just so I can tell the difference between my template and my skeleton. So now I have this template, and underneath it is the skeleton. So I'm gonna keep the skeleton visible. And now I'm gonna work on the curve here, and the curve here, and the curve here. And the way I do that is I use this tool, and I select this node, and I delete it. And once I've deleted it, then I have this handle that allows me to control the way that the curve is from this side, and I have this handle that helps me control the way that the curve is from this side. Now make sure that you're not creating a point here unless that's what you want. But what I do is just align this handle to this spot and this handle to this spot, and that's usually too pointy for my preference. And then I play around with it and just move them, make them a little bit less harsh. So sometimes I like my pattern to be more round, sometimes I like it to be more boxy. It's up to you, just play around with it until you're happy with it. And the bottom is the same. So the pink that we're seeing here is the skeleton layer, and it's good to have it visible so that you can follow the skeleton layer. And you can also hide the guides from this point, just makes it cleaner. And now the bottom also. So again, I delete this node, select this node, delete it, and I have this handle and this handle. So, oh, lost them. So just play around with it. If I lose the handle, oh, there it is. But if I lose it, I just grab onto this and pull it out, and then the handle becomes more visible. And what I like to do is just zoom out and make sure that this curve matches this curve in a visual sense, so that this one isn't more rounded or more pointy than this one. So maybe this is a bit too pointy, I don't know, maybe something like that. And if you hold down the control key, then it won't let you go like this, it'll only snap like this, so that it helps holding down the control key when you're on the straight line. So let's say this is good. Let's hide the skeleton and ask ourselves if we like this curve. And to make sure you're not editing the skeleton, you can also lock it. So there's this little lock here, and now you can't edit the skeleton. You can't mess it up by accident. And now we have this curve that we want to do. So I'm going to delete these two nodes, and I'm going to show my skeleton. And now what I want to do is have this one go straight along the lines. But it was still good to have the pink part of the skeleton as a guide. That's why I made these two nodes on the skeleton. Now let's hide the skeleton, and this is the template. And again, this is the stitching line, not the cutting line. So now that we've got our template finished, we want to duplicate that layer and rename the new layer to be topper and backer. And we can hide the template layer and lock it so that we don't mess it up. What we want to do in the topper and backer is also have the line going down here. So I'm going to take the Bezier tool again and draw a line from here to here, and then press enter. And that is my wing fold line. And now that we've got half of our topper and backer, I press Ctrl A to select all. And then I go to this tool and flip horizontally. Oh, I forgot to duplicate. So Ctrl D to duplicate and flip horizontally, and make sure that they snap. And once they snap, I deselect, and then I select this blue one and this blue one by selecting, holding Shift, selecting, and then path, union. Now I have this one piece for my topper and backer. And now this layer is done. And I can change the color just so I can tell the difference between the topper and backer and the template. So now I want to create a seam allowance for the topper and backer, and this is pretty cool. So the way I do that is I create a new layer, and I call it topper and backer SA, or seam allowance. And I'm going to put that underneath topper and backer. Now in my topper and backer layer, I'm going to select just the green shape without the lines. I'm going to duplicate by hitting Ctrl D. So it duplicated the shape, and now it's on top of the lines. It didn't erase the dots, it's just on top of them. And then I'm going to do right click, move to layer, and I'm going to move it to the new layer, topper and backer seam allowance. And I'm going to hide my topper and backer layer. So I'm going to only see the topper and backer seam allowance layer. And now I'm going to go to edit, preferences, inset outset by 7 millimeters, which is my seam allowance. If your seam allowance is different, you use different measurement and you can choose inches or whatever. And now path, when this is selected, path outset. So what that did was it grew this thing by 7 millimeters all the way around. So now if I show the topper and backer layer, we have this seam allowance that's 7 millimeters away from the topper and backer. Now let's just change the color just so we can tell the difference. So the topper and backer seam allowance is this blue, and then this green is the topper and backer. When we print it, we'll take off the colors, but just so we see which is which. So now for the core. So I'm gonna create a new layer called core, and I'm gonna go to my topper and backer layer. I can hide the seam allowance if I want. I'm gonna select just the green shape without the snaps or the lines. Hit Control D to duplicate, right click, move to layer, core, move. So now I have this shape in the core layer. And what I want to do is inset the core to be another 7 millimeters in. So we did outset to make this, and we do inset to make the core. Let me hide the other. So this is my core layer. I just go to path, inset, and we already made sure that it's 7 millimeters. And now this will be my core. Let's just change the color to something purple. So this is my topper and backer, and this is my core. Now we don't want the core to go over the wings. So what I do is I select the nodes that were created here and delete them. So I'm only left with this node and this node. Delete, delete. And once I have just these nodes, I hit Control and select this and make sure that it's exactly pointing down. That's what Control helps me do. And you can also just put it all the way in to the node, but it doesn't matter. Just pointing down and up is fine. And then you have your core that's 7 millimeters in from your pad once it's folded. And now if you want to have a guide for top stitching your core to your topper, you'd want to inset the core by another 7 millimeters, but I recommend not insetting the core, but rather insetting the original. Because when you inset something that you've already inset, sometimes it goes crazy. So what I do is I create a new layer and call it core top stitching, or however you want to call it. And then I hide my core. I have my topper and backer layer showing. Select this. And I'm going to change my inset preferences to twice as much. So if it's 7 millimeters, it's going to be 14 millimeters. And now I'm going to duplicate this, move to layer, core top stitching, move. And now I'm going to do path inset. So now that's inset compared to the core, that's inset by 7 millimeters. And again, I have to get rid of these nodes. Just make sure that this is straight. I'm hitting Control to make sure that it's snapped to the perfect vertical. Okay, so this is our core top stitching, and this is our core, and this is our topper backer, and this is topper backer seam allowance. So basically our pad is drafted. Now we might want to change some things like add some text, make the stitching lines dashed lines and stuff like that. So I'm just gonna, and remove all these colors. So I'm just gonna choose the color down here, this X, and also this one, X. Probably could have done them all at once, but never mind. So now there's no coloring except for my template and skeleton, which don't matter. I'm gonna leave them. And now what I can do is work on the lines. So I want to select my lines. So I'm holding Shift down and I'm selecting everything except for the dots. And then I go to Object, Fill and Stroke. And then I get this menu over here. And I go to Stroke Paint. It's black right now. And stroke style, I can change the width of it, so maybe to 5 millimeter or 0.5 millimeter line width. And let's leave it as a solid line. And now let's say that I want this one, because it's a stitching line, and this one is also a stitching line, to be dashed like this, or maybe you prefer something else. And also this fold line, maybe I just want it to be, maybe these dashes. Doesn't matter, whatever you think works. Maybe this is too noisy, I don't know. And now if I want to have the lines going down the center and this part here, what I'm gonna do is show the guides again. And I'm just gonna draw a line, snap it to the guide. So snap to the guide and snap to the guide, and then enter. And again, snap to the guide, snap to the guide, and enter, and hide these guides. And now if you want to make these different color or whatever, you can do that. And I'm just going to zoom in here. First I need to change to this tool, making sure Control is clicked so that I stay on the horizontal. And I just bring these in. And then I'm going to create a new layer called whatever you want to call it. And I'm going to move these two shapes. Move to layer, lines, move. So now what's left to do is just to write some text, I think. And I think that's it. I hope you found this helpful and not too difficult, not too long. If you did, leave me a comment. I'd be really happy to hear that someone found this helpful. And let me know if there's anything else you want me to show or clarify.